mass of data about you and what you thought of your own self in terms of the leader that no one else in the world has on me. So it was this first blush with trust, and they used that data. They used that data to hire another kind of support during the formal training program, whereby each candidate, whether they're traditional or non-traditional, and we had lawyers and judges and educators in there, had either a psychiatrist or a psychologist. When we went down to Greensboro, North Carolina, having gone through all of the training seminars, they would make videotapes of your session, and they would match that against the data that you bubbled up, and just have conversations. And near the end of this week-long experience at the Center for Creative Leadership, you had to go see, your analysts. And your analysts made some observations about whether you had it. And it was overwhelming for some. I mean, most people who were in that program, if not all, thought very highly of themselves. And they should have, whether their mother told them that or their wife or their kids. We all thought highly of ourselves. But near the end, it really became clear who would more likely to become a superintendent and who would more likely become an effective superintendent than just being in the program. It was very, very disconcerting to a number of individuals. So the psychologists and the psychiatrists who were there for formative purposes. Now, you need to continue that. There's nothing wrong with talking with a psychologist or analyst about your state and your healthiness, because you have to really look at it from a whole point of view, not just what you're doing here or in your heart, but your health and everything else. And the program prepared us in a way that certainly there are no regrets, and we've been for the better. And one thing that really struck me about the preparation side of the program, we did a lot of work in leadership, we did a lot of work in curriculum, and we did a lot of work about the politics of the superintendency in those 3 modules. When we were involved at the Center for Creative Leadership, we had a chance to look at our skills and perspectives around those skills in 2 main ways. They would give us case studies to solve around things that were very linear. And the folks who were coming out of the military background, boy, they could do that stuff fast, and they were running to the board, and, just taking it over. And those of us who were more conceptual didn't turn that stuff around as quickly as these other folks. And what it allowed you to do was to take a step back and see how you should build a team, and what things should be brought out in the team that you don't have a particular strength in. Then we went on the other side and really dealt with some free associative work. And the case study was the years 2050, you're the president of a new country, women have been abused in the previous country. How are you going to build your cabinet? And this is your cabinet as a president. And the military folks were just lost. I mean, those folks who used technical solutions for real adaptive challenges just could not handle it. And again, the observations were made. You had a chance to sit back and talk to the folks who were doing this analytic work. All of that built a huge trust amongst each of the cohort groups. So to this very date, we talk weekly. I mean, whether it's Denise, whether it's, I hired one of my colleagues in the superintendent's prepared. She's now the new chief financial officer, Dr. Don Arnold, and we consult with one another. And if we didn't do that through Danford, James, when we helped Rosa with her transition plan, it would have happened anyway. Through that network, it would have happened anyway. So for this program, I commend it, and certainly the one Bob is involved, because it really strikes at all those things that are missing from the formal process you go through in graduate school.
One of the things I wanted to say is that there are lots of similarities between the two programs, especially in the cohort effect of going through this experience with other people and then using those folks both as staff or working for them, but also in problem solving, having somebody that you can talk to that's not high risk, in your own community. The other thing I think that is important is the presence of African Americans and Latinos in numbers that are not found in the traditional preparation program. And it's kind of interesting that two of the better known programs in the United States are run by African Americans with a lot of expectation that that talent pool will be increased. For us, it's Black and Latino, and yours is as diverse as any, more diverse than ours probably. You have a larger cohort. But specifically designed, and I think it's important that someone of Floretta's stature and a university like Harvard focus on this issue of discovering and preparing and supporting Black talent and women. Our 2/3 of our program are women. Our participants are women too.
That's a very important statement, because to this very day, this country thinks there's an absolute quantifiable loss when you address diversity. That is, you're going to water down the pool. You're not going to have the same kind of intellect or drive because you have sacrificed it by having diversity. And it just strikes me, a little piece I was reading somewhere on the plane coming over, that the clerks for Supreme Court justices,
USA Today.
yeah, I don't know where it was, but it's that same issue. We can't find them. I mean, this is the year 2000 almost, and we're still making that claim, as indecent and as false as it is. We're still making a claim whereby superintendents prepared and the program at Harvard absolutely affirm the fact that it's easy to do both.
But Bob, what relationship that your program, what relationship do you all have, say, with the headhunters, and do you have an influence in that process based on trying to place minority superintendents?
Well, not as directly, obviously, as Floretta, who's in the search business. But yeah, I probably get 5 or 6 calls a week from the folks who are doing the searches. I have them come to our seminars and make presentations to our students. There's some that I will deal with. There's some that I will no longer deal with because I don't think that they're genuine in their search for the kind of diversity that we represent. But we have a very strong relationship with the search groups. Probably strongest with search firms that have African Americans in them, like Isaacson, Miller, Floretta, McKenzie's program, Wilson Riles, but certainly with all the rest of them too. The word spreads kind of quickly, at least in both of these programs. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with because Floretta's on my board and I'm on her board. Word has spread pretty quickly that these are places to come and look for candidates. And so I get lots of calls also from board members, especially Black board members, as to whether or not you have somebody who will fit our particular need, heard about your program, know you, or whatever the reason is. And so it's gone beyond even the search firms to the school board members who say, I'm not confident that the search firm's going to bring forth a Black candidate, and so that's why I've been told to call you, and I'll forward them to Floretta if I don't have anybody available.
Do you get feedback from the search firm, say if you recommend 3 or 4 year students to strengthen your program, and they're not selected, or they are selected?
Generally, I do. Initially I had to call because I didn't know these people. I hadn't been in the hunt for years. Now they call and pretty much give me feedback, primarily because I brought them to campus. And I pay their expenses. I just want you to come and talk to me about the search process and how you handle it. That's led me to suggest to my students that they not deal with certain search firms. these search firms that just don't take care of folks. The other conversation that we probably ought to have somewhere along the line is I also, and I know that Flo talks about this, tell my students not to apply to just any place.
Oh, yeah.
So the search firms that just want to have, you know, Bob Peterkin or Deborah McGriff's name every time so they can put a minority candidate up in any old district, what's the fit between your skills and, you know, your thoughts about the work that you want to do in that community's work?
The other thing that happens on this particular issue regarding selection, and as in superintendents prepared, we learn from one another about the search process. Even if you're a sitting superintendent or you wanted to get into the superintendency, there's a organized way by which we communicate with one another about lessons learned. And we talked about that a little bit earlier in the morning, but that's a critical benefit because all things aren't the same, will never be the same, but all of us have to take away and walk away with some lessons learned.
Let's move into another area of our discussion. I mean, we've sort of been talking about preparation. I think we ought to talk a little bit now about the actual superintendency itself. And I guess one of the questions I'd like to pose to get us started is, there's a concept floating out there called being in charge but not in control. And I'm just interested in how that reflects your superintendency or how it reflected when you all were superintendent. I mean, does that concept ring a bell or catch you in any way?
Well, for me, I think the place where it's strongest, I mean, where I am now with the Edison Project, we are very, very focused on, you can't hold people accountable if they can't hire their own team of people to work with. And it always amazed me that in Detroit, I was held accountable. I had 20,000 employees, maybe at max 20 that were not lifetime employees because of their union membership. And then of the 20 I could hire, had no real control over who they were because they all had to be approved by the board. So if the board didn't like who you wanted to hire, you still couldn't hire the person you felt was best for the job, yet you were held accountable for getting goals and objectives. So if you, to me, that was definitely in charge, but no control over the people to help you get the job done, or very little control.
Having had two superintendencies, I've got some ability to compare and contrast them. I felt that statement much more in Cambridge than I did in Milwaukee. The issue that Debbie raises over being a CEO without authority rubs everyone, I think, who's in the superintendency of being charged with doing the job, and then you've got all this so-called democratic process to go through. And in Cambridge, it would take me 4 months. Took 3-4 months to get your approval. I mean, there were times when it would take me 6 months to fill a position because the board would either hold it, not vote it, just parliamentary moving around, and have public hearings. In the meantime, the building principalship sits open with an interim person in there. And I guess you can work around that in certain ways. Milwaukee, a little bit less of that because I came in on a board vote. They pretty much approved what I wanted, even when it was difficult. You know, I removed somebody to put Deborah in the deputy's position. They went along with that. But you still had other issues. I mean, the teachers union here, not to talk out of house in Milwaukee, I thought was one of the most detrimental forces against school reform.
Still true.
Still true. I think there's a famous ex-superintendent in Milwaukee did a study on that, if I'm not mistaken. The legislature being intrusive in Milwaukee only, for instance. I mean, you know, the whole issue of having legislation in Milwaukee has affected no other city in in the state. The mayor's office, I think we find that across the nation now, being intrusive in different ways. So the expectation that you're really running things, I think you're right to sort of put some boundaries around that for us, because you guide, perhaps. I don't know if running them could be seen that way. And you've got to figure out a way to deal with the politics of that situation and manipulate it so that it does the least damage. The thing that I always wanted out of my superintendency was to get to the point where you could derive the most benefit rather than protect kids, get the least damage done to the programs that you wanted to pursue. On the other hand, I refuse to allow myself to be consumed by powerlessness. Mm-hmm. And I think, you just do what you have to do. I wasn't real good at counting votes, but I was going to put my issue on the table and I was going to fight for it forcefully. And part of it had to do with educating a board and trying to educate all the rest of the folks. And then once again, I said, at least getting them to do the least damage and get out of the way so that you can get on with the program.
Right. I want to follow up on your a couple of the places where you felt that there was some intrusion in Milwaukee, because it was very different in Detroit. When I first went, I met with Coleman and Coleman informed me that he ran the city and I run the school system. If you don't get in my stuff, I won't get in your stuff. But if we need to have a conversation, we'll have our conversations privately. And the entire time I was superintendent, he never said one word in the paper about anything I did. We had lots of private conversations, and he was very helpful, especially when I opened the male academies, and when I put the Malcolm X Academy in the one white community in Detroit. That wasn't you would have thought we were in the South the day that school opened. The helicopters, the police on horseback, there to protect those kids. I didn't have the intrusion from the governor's office or the legislature, because Detroit had just come out of the state was going to take over because of the major budget deficit. And John Porter, having been there for 2 years, calmed that down. And I was really in sync philosophically with what the governor wanted to see happen in a large urban school district. So those external factors that many superintendents will have to deal with, those were not present for me. But trying to get maximum cooperation from your board. It wasn't that the board wasn't cooperative, but it was the reality of knowing if they decided not to cooperate with you, there's really very little you can do. So trying to get them to do what you wanted to do. And the only time I've ever experienced work with unions in a number of cities, but I had never experienced a union voting for reform and then voting to tell their members not to participate. Empowerment or site-based management was a major reform in Detroit, which they approved. And it started moving, I guess, a tad too fast, because a lot of schools realized if I do this, I get a larger budget, because now I'm going to get a per pupil allocation rather than this old formula that was being used to fund the schools. And while they were negotiating a new contract, they sent out something to all the schools saying, don't vote to become an empowered school. I had just never. But that was about the weirdest union thing that I had happen, although I had a strike. Strikes happen.
I happened to be in Amsterdam and saw your picture in the paper about a 30-day strike.
I did experience.
Excuse me.
But one of the things I learned from that too, see, if you have a historical perspective, I went back to all the strikes they had had and how they played them and the coverage. You could have put my name in the first one, because the only thing that changed was how many days they were out and who the superintendent was. Mm-hmm. But the strategies and what they said were all the same. And it was, again, a way, as you say, distance, to have some distance and not take it personal, although they had some great slogans for me. Milwaukee, next time, send us beer. It was one of them. And I asked them, could I get the placards? And they didn't think that was too nice. I figured we were going to resolve this, and my grandchildren would like to see these one day.
But I have a different twist on being in charge and not in control. I've spent 8 years in the same position. I've only had one superintendency, and I have worked with 5 different board structures because of elections, re-elections, etc. I've experienced a teacher strike. We did not close school, not one day. They were out for 11 days, and It took courage, very painful process, and the superintendent was pointed at as the enemy because the goal is to close school. We kept school open every day with a very good plan. And I had the board at that time that supported what we put on the table. Very strong board at that time. I look from that standpoint. I look at we were in charge. I'm saying we, the board and the superintendent, and had control. And I learned from my union days with AFT. There are two things you don't do. Number one, you don't call a strike in the middle of the week of the first pay period or the second pay period. Number two, you don't call a strike close to a holiday. And this union president at that time violated those two rules. And I said to the board, and they bought into this, we have 11 days to make it to the Easter break. If we make it to the Easter break, this is over. Just stick with us for 11 days. Number two, you don't call a strike in the middle of the second pay period because you want the second week of the pay period because you want them to have a check while they're out on the picket line. So I felt we had good control, and we were in charge. And I'm saying we because I could not have done that.
I'm glad you realized that. Because when my board said we're not going to give them their pay raise, no matter how much I thought they should have, and I know you will eventually, I can't do a thing until the board decides.
So I'm
to
saying
give it to
we. It's 7 board members and the superintendent. And so we went through that process, and the big strike was over co-pay insurance. We could not continue to pay 100% of the premium of our employees. We were going broke. And we were able to get those things. And we got some great reform language in the contract. Once it was signed, dealing with site-based management, they did the same thing. The union president sent a notice out. We just agreed to that to get the strike over. We don't want to participate in this. And that created a lot of problems within the organization because of that statement, because then people start fighting this whole reform piece. But then on the other hand, personnel, I've never had a problem with hiring someone in the 8 years I've been there. But we have big problems in terminating people. Big problems. So I'm not in control because even if you go through the process and it's done right and you have a great case and you get to the board, do you have the votes? And under the board that hired me, we terminated a teacher in 1991, and we're still battling that case. Still battling that case 8 years later, still battling. So if you cannot hold people accountable, and if you can't hire and fire people, you don't have any control. I like what the coach of the Jets, Parcells, said. They want me to serve the meal, but they don't want me to buy any of the groceries. and that's the situation we're in. They want us to prepare and serve the meal, but they don't want us to bring the groceries to the table. So technically, we're not in control. And in charge is just a word when you look at the bigger picture based on what we're responsible for in this business.
One of the things that I recognized early on about this idea of in charge and not control, not being in control, is that you as the leader of the district cannot be seen as a person who reflects what this statement is.
Right.
Because this is a statement at the school level that teachers and administrators and others have used to hold back districts and schools from having kids move to higher levels of achievement. We're not in control of what happens on the outside of the school. Ergo, what do you really expect of me?
Right.
It creates, what we all know about the notion of learned helplessness. It creates this notion that we are helpless, and we have learned how to be competent in playing out this helplessness. So until somebody controls the outside and we get better students, we should not be held accountable for the performance of these students. So it's
Right.
another cut at
Yeah,
this.
no, but I think that's a really interesting point.
There's another
though,
cut at this, because you can never have, you
Right.
can never be seen. And I've observed superintendents, and Bob, and we could talk about it in Boston, who used to play this out.
Right.
And once people see you in that kind of position,
You're finished.
yeah,
Right.
you just raised the
Right.
ultimate question: why do we need you?
Right.
And if you're not here through leadership to make a difference. Now in Rochester, if you were to look at the state ed law, the Taylor law, superintendents are really not responsible for constructing a budget. The laws are so invasive, and if you were to abide by them, or allow your board to abide by them to the letter of the law, you would be at best an afterthought in that whole process. So you've got to move out there with, some safe assumptions that are firm through good leadership, that you've got to do certain things, even though the law doesn't prescribe you the opportunity to do that. We did do one thing in Rochester that was an interesting case study. The mayor had come through the community organization route to ascend to the mayoral position. He was the executive director of the Urban League, and was very much the person and the force behind holding the school district accountable for 20 years. At one point, I read a statement maybe about 8, 9 years ago that he said having an education in the school district was tantamount to child abuse. I mean, it's that kind of backdrop where the district was seen to be everybody's whipping board. I mean, we had a call last year. This is sort of the evolution of this attitude that the district is supposed to do everything, and it was the whipping board for everybody. This homeowner called last year about 7:15 in the morning, was giving my administrative secretary a hard time about this dog, which had dumped on the lawn of this homeowner. And she had seen the dog come from one of our high schools. I wouldn't, and wanted us to take care of the dump. And more importantly, thought we were responsible because this dog had just come off the yard of the high school campus and went over to her lawn and made some business.
You should have been responsible.
Is this a metaphor? Where's this going? Where's this going?
There are some things, of course, we can't control. That being one. But you set yourself up in this position where you're supposed to be responsible for everything, and there are things that you're obviously not. So the mayor moved some legislation through the delegation which allowed the superintendent of schools in Rochester to select his or her own senior staff without board approval. Doesn't sound like a big deal in mod management.
No,
It is huge.
It's in Massachusetts too.
Massachusetts.
The board does not vote on
Right.
any personnel
Any.
issues. It's the superintendent.
Any.
This is
All the way
a
up and down.
major issue.
Almost,
That's not
almost
uniform.
got me back into the superintendent. This is exciting.
This is good stuff.
It is, and it was
That's
huge
major.
in the culture of Rochester, where, the board has been too much in the business of the operations of the district. And it creates sort of a culture whereby they think it's just normal to do that. It is not abnormal. It is not something that's done by exception. It is routinely done, and I've seen previous superintendents just go along with it. So they have, I think, just given up their authority to be superintendent-like, even though the laws will support, to this date, boards of education. So I would argue that leadership is very key in this area, whether it's prescribed by law or not.
Yeah, I think it's symbolic leadership.
Right.
You will still, as the superintendent, fight for the person you want, put it out there 5 times until you get a vote, or you pay the person you want in an active position. because you're gonna have some level of control, at least symbolically, and the perception. When in reality, you know, the person should be full-time. I should not have had to go through this 5 times to get it done. But the reality of the way the law is, and that boards have the power to approve in Michigan at that point, what else can you do?
Yeah, I think when I was looking at this question, and the way you raised it, Cliff, really, you know, made me stop and think about this, because maybe the real issue is defining really what you are in control of and what you're not in control of. But I think when I was looking at it initially, it was like, if something happens in the school district, people look at you and they say, you know, do something. And you know,
Even if it's a dog on a lawn.
you know, or even things that really are more germane, say, than
Right.
that one. I mean, you know, when people stop you in the
Everything.
supermarket, I mean, I always used to carry a little thing in my pocket, a little note card. And whenever anybody came up to me and said, I know this is a bad time, but I'd always take it out. Because you know that they're getting ready to tell you about something that's happening to one of their children or something. And they're really talking to you because they believe that you should be able to actually resolve that problem. And it might be a problem that you would want to resolve, but for a whole variety of reasons, it's not that simple. You can't just go in there and say, do X. But it is true that there are certain things you can do. For example, I remember my first school visit, and I went out to the German immersion school. And I mean, one of the first few. And I looked up, and the people had been complaining for, I don't know, a year or something, about shades. The shades were torn, and they wanted some new shades. One thing I did discover you could do as a superintendent, you could go back and
that made people happy.
They go out there and get these shades. I mean, there were elements that I have to admit that we were in control of. You could have a definite impact on what went to the board in the budget. You might not ultimately be able to control it, but given the realities of the budget, you could get a significant percentage of what it is that you thought ought to be in there, assuming you even knew what it was, given how much you knew about this budget that they put in front of you. So I think, I'm glad you raised it the way that you did, though, Cliff, because if we don't deal with that, we would fall into that same trap when these people say, oh, how do you expect us to educate these kids when they're coming from these poor families? We ain't in control of the breakfast and the conditions at night. So, hey, how can you expect us to do anything? I think that's a very important point on that.
I mean, I think it's our job to lead. I mean, regardless of whether or not you have the power or the authority or whatever, I think you lead until somebody stops you from.
That's right.
You
You
say,
ask
wait a minute,
kids.
wait a minute. No, you can't do that, Mr. Superintendent. That's the board's, that's the board's authority. Because people are, I think, Howard, you're right. People are looking to you to lead, think you can lead, and the more you lead, the more you'll be able to lead
Right.
in lots of different ways. One of my colleagues once said, well, they own the store. And my response was, so do I. I mean, who has greater ownership of the results in this district than I do as superintendent of schools? Whether it's a complaint from somebody, as you recognize, or the reason that you got into work, which was to make this, the board's not going to make this better.
Right.
You know, they don't have the expertise to make this better. We have the expertise to make it better.
Can I put another slant to this? I don't know if the rest of you felt this way, but these are sort of the friction between what you know to be real, but what you feel. Although I technically knew that people in the district had responsibility for doing certain things, but I really personally felt responsible for every negative thing that happened in the school system. While I know I didn't drive the bus, and if a bus driver left a kid on the bus and the mother was complaining, I'm not the bus driver, but I still felt responsible. A kid died in a pool when I was superintendent. I mean, there are a list of things that when terrible things happen, I don't know how you cannot feel personally, it's like the buck does stop at your desk, and somehow you should have been able to anticipate or know something about these kinds of things. The other thing I discovered, that once it happened to you, it's been a chronic thing with the bus department, or it's been a chronic thing with pools before, but you didn't know the history of the system. So you over here working on this set of problems you knew about, you couldn't work on these until there's another crisis to correct them. But I always felt like there was a pressure.
I think there's a symbolic leadership issue that you're kind of just raised with me, and I just got in an argument about this with some folks in Boston. I think there are times when your presence is needed as a superintendent. I think certainly in tragedy, sometimes in celebration, but there are times when I think everybody looks at the superintendent of schools and says, there is either my hope, there's my aspiration, or there is, I'm just so glad that somebody cares enough about my child to be there.
No, that you care enough.
You care enough.
Because it might not be enough that you sent your deputy.
Oh, no,
But when the
right.
superintendent shows up,
And there are times when you can't do that. I mean, it's one of the reasons that we tried to kind of set up this co-superintendency thing here, because you can't do them all. So you've got to have somebody who knows the mission, who can show up with as much force as you do. But, I went to funerals. I mean, if my children were murdered, I went to funerals.
Sure.
Now, you could say, well, supposing 100 kids got,
Go to
I'd go to 100 funerals. You can, if I'm not here, if I'm, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, what is more precious? And I just think that we have ways of representing the hopes and aspirations and feelings and civility and humanity of a system. I won't get too, flowery about this. That is very, very important, especially to disenfranchised folks.
But people look at us in cities, in Dayton, a group of senior citizens came to me. They were getting ready to tear down their apartment building because they had drugs in it, and the city said, tear it down and you force the drug dealers. And they came to me asking me to help them. And I don't know anything about. And they met with me in my office, and I said, why did you all come to me? They said, well, you seem to speak out on issues. And all of us speak out on issues, and they see us. And I went to the city manager, went with them to the city manager. And the city manager tried to convince me why they should tear this building down. Now, I don't think I had any influence on the issue, but they did not tear the building down. I think there were other issues there, but it brought the issue to attention of the community. And senior citizens, no children in the system, but they made sense. We don't have any place to move when they tear our building down. Where are we going? But I think the whole piece where we are the top individuals in our communities. We hire the largest number of people. We probably have the largest budgets in the community, and the position carries power. Now, my question is, how do we utilize the power to educate children?
Right,
How do we use that?
now that's a key issue with that. Hold that thought, because I wanted to raise this with Bob. I found myself torn on when tragedy would happen in a building. Like, for example, I remember when the only incident where a kid actually got shot, well, there were two. One was shot in the toe, but an incident where a kid actually got shot in the school. And while, we were fortunate it wasn't fatal, and everybody wanted me to run out to the school. And what I did was I didn't go out to the school. The reason why I didn't go there wasn't because I wasn't concerned, is I didn't want to usurp the authority and power of that principal. I mean, I was trying to make a case for the principal is really in charge of his or her school. What I did do, though, was to call a press conference to say, I'm very supportive of what the people are doing in the school. I've looked at it. I think that they did everything that you could humanly have done, in this case. And then I also raised the issue of that there was I think an assistant superintendent or something who was killed in a building out in Wauwatosa.
Right.
And so my argument was, I'm waiting to see how you, the press, are going to handle this, because you didn't condemn the entire Wauwatosa school district when this occurred in their building. Now, are you going to condemn the entire Milwaukee public school system because of this incident in the building? But I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, was that there was a part of me that wanted to go out there to that building. But I felt if I did that,
I think you did the equivalent.
Right, you know.
I mean, what I'm talking about is being visible on
the issue.
on the
key
issue,
issues.
right,
And,
right.
no,
Right.
I mean, I remember a time while a building burned that both of us showed up. I mean, that was a little overkill, firemen said, well, we can put this out. What are you doing here? I just think it's the visibility on, as you said, on these key issues for a community that, no, you don't have to run to the building every time. I use the funeral thing as kind of dramatic.
No, see, I totally agree with
Right,
that.
I don't think that there's any
right.
substitute for that, but you
Exactly.
said a larger framework that kind of supports 150 other principles should something happen in their,
Right.
in their building.
Right, because the opposite had occurred to me when I think back to when I removed a couple of principles. I probably would have done it the same way, but I mean I would have done it but done it differently. And that was in the middle of a building being totally out of control. I actually took two principles out in the middle of that, but I did it because everything told me, and all of the evidence I got from everybody was that these people could not bring this to closure. I mean, they couldn't deal with it. But a lot of the principals, though, in the beginning had a real shaky thing because their thing then was, well, if anything ever happens in my building, are you going to immediately remove me? And my response always was, no, it depends upon how you're handling it and my perception of whether or not you can handle it.
And this is really at the heart of the matter. As we talk about in charge but not in control, and move it into some conceptual context, because we are expected to do everything, and we cannot be everything to everybody. So there's this sort of tension point here, and if you accept that, the choices we make in terms of where we are visible are important to help increase the credibility of the district and around core values that are important to the district. And I've watched some superintendents who used to be everywhere, and they confused visibility with credibility.
Credibility, right.
And what they thought they were gaining in visibility, they were losing in credibility. And importantly, they were losing the sense of focus for the district because they were out trying to placate all of these different groups and really lost focus on the educational agenda. And that's a notion about this, because we're in charge of who we want to see, we're in charge of where we go, and for you not to make that decision to go to the school was an important one, as I heard you, because some people would have preferred, well, here's the superintendent, right, here's fix it, and he or she comes, and everyone else can back off and act out the part of being either helpless or, someone else is going to take it over. And we want our principals to be practicing leaders so that you won't have to think that they're only going to be designated leaders where, you do it because I told you to do it. And it only happened because the superintendent said, this is what I'm telling you to do. You want them to step up around situations for which they're responsible and they feel a need, and they'll be, truly practicing leaders.
I think the one I want to ask you to talk a little about who the people are and how you set your own priorities when you're a superintendent to have that sense of credibility. But I think you hit on another point too, and that's how you delegate. And because the first thing, if you don't learn as a superintendent, you cannot run the system by yourself. And if you don't have people you trust and people that you let do their jobs, nothing's going to happen. And if everything has to go through you, you have to sign off on everything, it's just not going to work. So sort of the combination, delegation, the groups that you felt you needed to maintain credibility to, and how did they support or hinder what you were trying to do?
When I first came into Rochester, it was clear to me in the culture of the city and the district that everybody had some wannabe gene in them. Everybody had the wannabe gene superintendent in them. And you got advice any time of the day, any day of the week. And I had to shape an agenda that I wasn't going to be everything to everybody without people feeling disengaged. And as I came in, I had, or this. As I came in, I had to create this notion of what success looked like, and success had to be for adults defined through the success of kids, because it had been an adult culture. People were arguing about, who's at the table, and the shape of the table, and whether or not, you got 3 of your tribal members there, and someone else has 5, and it was all of this stuff about process and enablers, and no one was focusing on the achievement of kids. I mean, no one was even discussing that. It was all about so-called empowerment, and we had to set these clear standards first, these performance standards and the content standards for children, and then everything else had to be framed in that context. What I've done recently, knowing that it's now in the culture, we've got all of these performance benchmarks at the district level, at the school level, subject area, classroom and grade level, and teachers are not questioning any longer, well, whose benchmarks are those? They are using their work against the district benchmarks. That is what their kids are doing. We have some schools now that have kids setting targets themselves. I know I can get that, and it's now all in a real context. So on the public engagement side, one of the things I knew I was ready for this year, because the tone had been set and the direction had been set, I have these Wednesday afternoon brown bag sessions. And I've had one of my art teachers create this brown bag, and we got a bowl of fruit. And folks from the community, anybody, can just come and see the superintendent. You don't need an appointment, but you can get one if you'd like. I have phone time. I worked it out with the phone company that they have a special line for me on Wednesdays, and I go crazy on Wednesday afternoons purposely, because that's my day to get up and do that. And I dedicate my day to do that, and we have a follow-up plan, and it's all trying to drive the district towards this notion of customer satisfaction, and looking at what Xerox has done about that. And it allows us now to take these things in some context, because I bring appropriate staff members there to do the follow-up, of course.
That's what I'm saying.
To do the follow-up.
You have a great meeting. People say, I hate you when you have these meetings, because you come back with this whole list of stuff for
Right.
us to do.
Right. And they're there, and they're learning how to address these issues, and they're responsible for making sure that they're done with a clear set of standards to determine a level of satisfaction, both with respect to time and the content of what people are bringing to the table. So it's changed it around, and you've got board members saying now, oh, have you seen, the schedule? Go see Dr. Janey, it's Brown Bag Day. And so they're not hit as much with all of that craziness that they get, and you need to protect their interest, because that's a legitimate interest that they have. And the mayor has the same interest, because they'll call the mayor, they'll call the city council about things. And so they're able to load up in an organized way for us their constituents that want to make a point. Well, I saw the superintendent, and he or she did. But I've got staff there, and it's recorded. We send a letter out in 48 hours, and we get back to folks, and we do repeats if they need to come back to us in 2 weeks. And it's done a lot of positive stuff in the district, because I chose not to do any of that when I first came in. And people thought, well, is he distant? Is he from the community? All of those things began to come up, and I tolerated a certain amount of distance, because I was cleaning up the academic agenda. And I had to do that first. And then I'm at a point now where I can do the things that I like to do like that, but do it in an organized way.
But I think you were also, as Cliff was laying that out, trying to get into maybe a next stage of this, and that is trying to understand how each of these elements sort of either help you or is helping you, during your superintendency. So I'd like to raise one about boards, for example. I mean, how each you sort of perceive the role of the school board.
Is this on tape?
No, we're going to leave you out. Just this side of the table to talk about. All of the city superintendents right now. Or maybe I'll go out and get the bag and you can put the bag over there. So what about these school boards? Bob, what about your experience?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We've had this conversation in class the other day because Boston now has an appointed school board rather than an elected school board. And are you sacrificing democracy on the other hand, given the history of Boston? Or are you creating stability and sanity, given some of the history of the boards there? I think this is the thing that superintendents are least prepared to deal with, school boards. And, you know, that old joke about the care and feeding of school boards. Working school boards hinder in lots of ways if they're not tended to. And, you know, I made a difference between the Cambridge board and my first superintendency and the Milwaukee board. No amount of tending to the Cambridge board would take care of the need that they had to micromanage and do their public persona, and to be involved in a process and involve every single last person in a process, which just elongated every single bit of work that we tried to do. So in that way, it was not helpful, it was in fact intrusive. They didn't want a long-range plan because that means that we'd have some sort of conformity across the schools, and Cambridge is much too sophisticated to have that kind of thing. Meanwhile, you know, black kids' achievements falling off the cliff in this so-called racially and culturally diverse school system, and working with them to get them to the place where they would think about equity for all the kids, getting them the supports and remedies to the statistics that black staff put before them on how kids are faring in the high school, getting them to understand that Debbie had to change the face, as I said earlier, of gifted and talented instruction and lots of other curriculum matters, was always pulling teeth. Was always pulling teeth, and that's with a so-called liberal school board. On the other hand, I really thought when I came here to Milwaukee in '88 that the board had a larger command of the issues. You know, it was a 7-2 board, even though they voted for me 9-0. Y'all get those unanimous votes too?
Yeah.
Public unanimous votes.
Yeah, right.
You know, they essentially agreed during the interview process that they were going to support the agenda solidly for at least a year, and that they were going to give me the votes. You know, and we put them to the test pretty early, and they sustained, and you know, holding them together wasn't nearly as difficult around an agenda. And if you remember, I mean, we really shook the place up when we were here, and they held together pretty well. But as the boards begin to change, you know, as people move on to other things or get tired of the haranguing, it became much more difficult in times when I needed near unanimous support on some very, very tough issues to pull the board along and down the right road, and constantly remind them of what we had put in place and what we were trying to do. One of the vehicles that we used were retreats. We went on a lot of retreats my last year here because we were in crisis. I mean, I'd announced we were leaving, Deb was going to leave, the secretary business manager decided to leave, and so the president and I began to say we need to get away someplace and have conversations about how we hold the school system together in your, you know, and in fact, you have to almost pull back for a way and let the president lead for a while and move on to the next superintendent and try to make the transition as smooth as possible for whoever's going to take your place. So I just think the boards, the balance of power is wrong. I mean, we had a conversation earlier about, if I'm going to do the job, then let me select the people to do the job, and don't make me have to come to an agreement about, you will vote for Dr. McGriff as the deputy superintendent, just let me bring her on here and set it up and let's make this work. So, two different, well, more than two different boards. I lost the majority of my board in Cambridge in less than a year. 2 deaths and 2 people who decided not to run. So a 7-member board, I had 3 of them left by the time I started my second year. And we talk a lot about turnover of superintendents. I'm much more concerned about the turnover of boards. James, you talked a little bit about that earlier.
And they elected every 2 years in Cambridge, so a
Whole
person.
board.
Every year, so you get on, you learn in 1 year if you're new, and you're running the second year, so it was a different situation. I want to, and I think what Bob hit on a couple of things. One, for me in Detroit, it was like almost perfect initially, because I had a board that ran as a reform board. They ran as a team, called themselves the Hope Team. They had an agenda. They looked for people who had histories of school-based management, choice schools, and so there was a philosophical agreement on what the goals of the system needed to be. Where you have the problem is not on the goals, but on the strategies.
Right.
You can both agree on decentralizing power to the school. You can have very different ideas about how to get it done. And then, once again, the changing of the board. When they decided not to give the teachers a raise and had that strike, on the next election, the union decided, you will not get reelected. One of them came back. Now, they had enough influence on the board that I still had the majority of the board vote, but it was not the solidarity
Right.
of vision and principle and the leadership that kept people together and working in a professional and quick way, and that sense of urgency. And when you lose that, then it becomes much more difficult to get work done. And when I think about boards I've seen, I didn't have a terrible time with the board, but I wouldn't say it was perfect, because nothing is perfect, but it wasn't worst case scenario. And it started out on a much more positive, upbeat note than any board experience I had because of the collective wisdom, and that they ran on an agenda. They didn't just run to be school board members, and we were on the same page.
Let's take a break here.
Everybody's knocking at the door.
Yeah. Timing, Gene, you're gonna do an hour more on this, and then get
And we'll see where we're at. We'll see where we're at.
to two. You won't be too far out.
We'll see where we're at.
I think moving.
We had gotten into the question of, how some of these various entities hinder and or support, your superintendency, or, when you were the superintendent. And we ought to feel free to talk about those that we really want to deal with. We had been talking some about the board. You had gotten to the point of talking about what happened when your board changed.
Right, and I wanted to add one more piece to the board. I had a pay for performance contract, and we clearly agreed on what the goals were going to be, but I wanted to get back to that notion of how difficult it is, even when you agree on goals, that back to this point of how do you hold a superintendent accountable if they can't hire their own team. And the friction was, if you're going to set the strategies for achieving the goals, then I don't really have a pay for performance accountability contract. You have to set the goals and say, this is where we want kids to be, this is where we want customer satisfaction to be, whatever the issues are. But as a superintendent, now I have to have the authority and ability to reach those goals with my team. And the friction on some strategy issues undermine the ability to have a really strong accountability program and to have a really powerful pay for performance initiative.
Could you expand on that a little bit more, or were there specific examples?
The example that I used was the board was very committed to empowered schools, and empowerment for them were schools that had site-based management, including a site-based budget. Because it was difficult, and you had to convert an existing school required a certain vote. One of the things that I felt I had learned was that you have to create a critical mass of people engaged in an innovation before it takes off, because not everybody wants to be the scout or the pioneer, but enough people get out there first and other people come on board easier because they're not the first risk takers. My strategy was to open new choice schools, and all of the choice schools would be empowered schools and would vote to become empowered, which they all did. And this would be a faster way to jumpstart the initiative, which would enhance it in other schools. And it was just the friction between the choice strategy, as an example, and just trying to get existing schools to vote. Either way you got to your goal of empowerment, but the strategy of getting there is not exactly the same strategy. And you could talk about that on any issue. How do you enhance customer satisfaction? You could have one set of strategies for getting it done. The board could pass a resolution any night that would direct you in a different way than you had intended to go. And you have to, implement all of the policies that the board passes.
From a sitting superintendent standpoint, and having experience working with maybe 6 different boards over the 8 years, and basically I've had a pretty good board, I would say, especially comparing with what my peers share with me. I've had a pretty good board. And based on issues and things that would impact children to a certain extent, they were willing to take the risk in supporting things that we've done. For instance, outsourcing and contracting out for services, and I mentioned earlier the teacher strike and things of that sort. We united as a board and stuck together. But now I have noticed we're getting a different type of board member that are more politically driven than looking at issues that will impact children. And we're getting a younger group of board members coming on the board. So the
Or is the superintendent getting older?
combination. And so you're right. I never thought
They're all the same.
And I can recall that my first 4 years, I had a 7-0 vote on everything. My first 4 years. Of course, I did my homework to educate them, and now I see a change in that, regardless of whether I've done the homework to the satisfaction of all the board members. There's still gaps in the voting, and my board is still considered to be a good board, but not as risky as the previous boards that I've had. They're not risk takers. On the charter school issue, they were very cautious about that, and on vouchers, which are coming to our district, I try to get them to see that we might disagree with vouchers, but how can we use vouchers to help to improve the system and utilize that? And they're not there yet, so it's a different type of board. But to last as long as I've lasted, I think you got to say the board was pretty good and innovative, because to me that's the exciting part. If we can't continue to change, it becomes very boring in this position. So I'm a strong believer that great organizations change before they have to change, and we've been able to do that.
Are you spending more time with them now that you've noticed that change? I mean, is there any change in your relationship with them?
I'm spending less time.
Less time?
Less time as a group. I'm spending more time as individuals. The new board now will come in on an individual basis and talk about issues, and which is the other one would work as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And the attention span is much shorter. Where with my previous boards, we would spend a weekend at a retreat. Now to get my present board to sit for 3 days at a retreat is just about impossible, because one board member will look at the big issues and not interested in the detailed information. 2 board members would like to have every I dotted and T crossed and everything else. 3 board members like to have all of the background information in a big document, and then the others just want a one-pager. So I'm shuffling, I'm meeting the needs of all of them, and it's becoming tougher because it's not giving all the board members all the information. Then they're getting more and more into the politics of the community, and where historically, if you called one of my board members, first question, have you talked to the superintendent? No, we'll call the superintendent. Now, if you talk to one of the board members, they try to solve the problem. And then it's creating more work for my staff, because then we have to undo some things and deal with that. So I see that change coming gradually.
I've learned a lot in the last couple of years in Rochester, having a change in the board from those who appointed me to those who are there now. We have a 7-member elected board, elected citywide, and I was coming in at the point of an election, and they rotate the election. So there was an election when I came in, some folks retired, and then there was an election just last year, so they rotate these terms. And an interesting cultural feature amongst the Rochester board is that we had 4 members who had served 15 years or more as board members. We only have one of them remaining. He's been there maybe 17, 18 years now, and the rest are fairly new. The majority is new. So the first thing I tried to do when I came in was to set up this framework, which I shared with you guys last time, that I learned from Conflict Management Incorporated. The framework that talks about decision-making around what issues should you really negotiate, around what issues do you consult, but you still make the call, and around issues that you need to keep your board informed. It's very, very difficult for that particular board 2.5 years ago to understand and embrace that decision-making framework. Because what I did was, we just listed all the decision points that had to be addressed this year, and how would we go about it. Because they were so used to meeting on everything, it was tough for them to back up. And I found that to be true of also the union and school-based management teams at the local level, where the school-based management end and district-wide decision-making began, and the reverse of that. Now I have a board that understands it and has embraced it. And I began to just pick and choose those things that I wanted to use within that framework 2.5 years ago, but now I can do it, fully loaded because of the change in the board. I've always looked at board members in terms of their roles in 3 different areas: as elected officials, no special order, but elected officials, commissioners, and community advocates. Regardless of whether it's a professional board member, they still have a constituency whom they always want to address. And then I've tried to look at, given those 3 roles, how are they engaging in those roles with their constituents? When they're commissioners, do they really know how to play the role as a commissioner of education with respect to policy? And do they want to? And are they effective? I have found that one to be the most challenging to work with boards. And I find that they are engaged and they are, on balance, fairly effective as elected officials, meeting with city council members, the mayor, depending upon who the mayor is, and with the delegation from the state and the congressional delegation. They enjoy that. They like to be seen in that context. It's pretty much one you can do, out of self-interest, and it's a win-win. When you talk about the advocacy role, though, that's when you talked about, James, you can get all over the place, and it's difficult to get it focused, and that's why I've tried to set up this brown bag. So it gives the board members an obvious, structured target that they can just funnel that information to my office, and we can go about it. But I think now, using that framework that I learned from CMI, it's helped out immensely. The new board has restructured its bylaws. They meet only once a month now. Speakers at the meeting can only speak to agenda issues. If the issues are not on the agenda, they come at the very end when the media is gone. We had a process before that anybody could speak. If it took 2 hours, it took 2 hours, and we could never get to our business. They could never be board-like because they were playing so much to the advocacy role. So they've really structured the bylaws now around the process that allows them to be much more board-like. And they've put in community conversations, like bi-monthly, so we have a community conversation whereby we have people sign up, and board members are assigned then to focus groups with professional facilitators, and we come back as an assembly and go over that, and then we move an agenda. It's just given a lot of coherence to what we used to do very haphazardly.
What this reminds me of is that when we talk, our situations are so different that without the background, because only when you mention that, the Hope team had already put that in place. And when they lost the election after the strike, a lot of the structure that kept a meeting very professional started to fall away. And Milwaukee is, you don't talk at board meetings at all. You don't come to, you come to a subcommittee meetings, and that's where the community, and so if you come out of a situation where things like this are given, in this conversation, I wouldn't bring them up. But then if it wasn't there when you came and there was something you had to put in place, it becomes an important issue.
Let me ask a question. Do you have a different relationship, or what kind of relationship do you have with black board members? Majority of your board?
Majority of my board, 7 members, 2 white members, 1 Hispanic, and we have 4
African Americans?
I have 4 African American men and 2 white females and 1 African American female. And this is a first for us based on that structure. Historically, it's been 4-3-5-2, majority white. But now we have a majority African American on the board. And the politics from the community, Dayton is segregated by housing. And we have a tendency to, my board has a tendency on the African American side, constantly talk about the west side, which is the African American side of town, what's best for that community. As a superintendent, I look at children to hopefully do what's best for all children, and understanding there are gaps there, and the lowest achieving students in our community are the African Americans, so we have to give that attention to them. We have a pretty good relationship, one-on-one relationship. Collectively, we're still struggling trying to find our identity, if I may use that word, based on what process are we going to use to get issues through. And that has created some challenges for the total board as well as for the superintendent.
We used,
You were the Kente Cloth Board.
oh yeah, we were very African-centered.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Hey, if you go into a city and every board member wears a kente cloth to a meeting, if you're the superintendent, you're gonna get you a nice collection too, if you got any sense.
So I thought y'all were on the same wavelength.
No, when I was sworn in, I was given one. You know, sort of my official.
Might have a few problems with that, but I guess. I'm losing my train of thought on a piece that you mentioned about how you organize. One of the things that I did was to use my goals as a way to organize board meetings. For example, at the curriculum committee, we always started by showcasing academic performance of kids, awards, whatever. Then there was a committee that dealt with. Explain your committee process, because I'm not. Go back
Oh,
to
they
the
have,
top.
the
We're not
board had 4 or
committee-driven.
5 committees.
I only have 3.
Well, whatever they
2.
are, curriculum, personnel.
Finance and.
Couldn't find something for
policy.
finance,
Finance
but
and policy.
we had a personnel committee, and there we always recognized teachers, not retiring people, but teachers and principals who have brought recognition to the district because of their work for kids. And we never opened a board meeting without a student performance.
But
And
what-
so,
explain the committee, because that's new to me. I mean,
well, it was a committee of the
number
whole
of
in
committees
Cambridge.
that
There
you
were no
thought.
committees. So in
Okay.
Cambridge, everything was done through the whole board.
Okay.
Milwaukee had committees. I had responsibility for the curriculum committee. Bob didn't even come to that meeting.
And every other committee.
so it was made up of board members.
Board members,
Right, you have
right.
3 board members generally. Finance, intergovernmental relations, which was a committee of the whole,
Right.
personnel.
So every
several
board in
different
some
committees.
cities have 2 or 3 or 4
And that's the only
committees.
place the public could speak.
And
Right.
those were to get, and the items went to the curriculum, those committees, before they go to the whole board meeting for final approval.
But what's interesting about it though is, it isn't like you have the discussion at the committee meeting and then the board, the committee makes a recommendation to the board, the same discussion starts all over.
Oh, okay.
At the board level.
Some of them passed
No,
automatically.
some of them are passed in the
but
past.
Yeah, they pull them out.
They
You know,
pull out
you'd
anything
submit
that-
the whole report, which would be all of the committee reports, and then you'd ask for separate.
And there might be hundreds of recommendations,
Right,
but
right.
you know they're gonna pull the 2 or 3.
Right.
They're gonna pull a couple.
Right.
hot ones.
And what you like them to do is let you know which ones they're gonna pull,
They're gonna
because then
pull.
you're gonna have 50 questions on the ones that are not going to pass without
We
discussion.
also,
But
we
it's
also
still,
had a meeting of the chairs of the
Right.
committee.
we did that
Right.
too.
Before,
Plan the agenda.
before
Plan
you
the
go into
agenda.
the committee thing,
A
so.
board member chaired that?
Right.
Yeah.
The president of the
President of the
board
board.
chairs it, and the chairs of each of the committees meet
You have 4
together.
board members
to
sitting
set
in
the
a room
board
deciding
agenda.
on the agenda for the next month.
Okay.
But that meeting was open, so you'd always have the union rep.
Started out closed.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were challenged.
Sure,
Yeah.
challenge. And so then, so you're sitting there and you got the union reps there. And I don't know where, I'm sure you all did the same thing. We'd bring in the key staff members,
Right.
you know, who'd have to sit there because they'd have to talk about what some of these items were, what type of information was needed, and et cetera.
Right. So the complexity of how your board organizes needs to be on the table, I think, too, for people to understand the discussion. So if you're talking about a board that meets once a month and everything is in a committee of the whole, there are things that you just can't do there.
Do you agree with that process? And I'm going back to a question we had earlier about the control issue and in charge. Is that?
Is it, I mean,
the process of the committee.
Well, they changed it while I was the superintendent, actually. They moved to a committee of the whole process. I don't know if you all knew, but they got rid of a number of those committees.
And just everybody heard the.
Yeah, and then they had a committee of the whole, but they actually now have reestablished those.
And the
committees.
superintendent had to attend all the committees?
oh yeah, excuse
No.
me, here was my schedule at least. I spent every Tuesday with my board and I went to visit schools every Wednesday. Whether it was a board meeting or a committee meeting, that was my Tuesday. Either meeting with them before the public meeting, because they spent the whole day at the central office, and they had their staff and their space. So Tuesday was board day.
Right. See, Rochester, when they went to these new bylaws, and these were put in just early in the year, they created 4 committees to the board versus the 7.
7,
Well, because, I'm going back to Bob's question, when
Ooh.
the board, the composition of the board became majority minority, and we had 3 African-American men and 1 African-American woman on the board. Last time around, they felt it was their turn, and the display of power was
Created.
evidenced through all of these committees, and I'm in charge. The new board knew about the public criticism of micromanaging, and they were very much interested in presenting themselves to the public in a way by which, you know, the mayor and the council in particular, as well as the business community, would see them in concert with the superintendent's agenda, because we're a fiscally dependent district. They compressed the committees to 4. They created community conversations, and they changed, you know, the agenda, and they eliminated the Human Resource Committee, Bob. There's no Human Resource Committee, and they did that as a way to give some tailwind support to the new legislation that came in, that we're not messing with the superintendent's agenda.
Okay.
And they did that
The stamping
deliberately,
agenda.
and it's established credibility in the public, like, and it's symbolic and substantive. I mean, if someone wants to come in and talk about an issue regarding human resource or an assignment or appointment, you know, they can, but there's no public display that there's a godfather now, you know, doling out.
Favors.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing I liked about it, I guess, if I was gonna have to have it, James, is that it prohibited board members from getting anything on the agenda at a board meeting and past that night. So unless they go through the board voting to accept an item, every agenda item had to come through the committees. Well, effectively, we controlled the committee agenda. I mean, the president
I had
didn't
a
come in with
staff
an
person in
agenda.
Milwaukee who
That's a whole job, full-time job.
was the board agenda.
We would come in and say, Madam President, these are the items that we want to present in these, blah, 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 you know, we've got this left over from, you know, board member so-and-so's agenda. She's asked us to look at something. I'm not ready this month. I don't want to put on the agenda. President says not on the agenda. Doesn't get on the agenda. So it was more of control mechanism to kind of funnel all the issues to them. When we got here in '88, it had been such a controlling vehicle, however, that my predecessor used it to keep information from the board. So he would not bring issues to the board and just would do them on the side. And so now they wanted everything to come through, and we were very open about it. We didn't care. I mean, you know, it wasn't anything that I wanted to hide. I want the board knowledgeable. So that's what we used it for, because you couldn't have that kind of conversation at the board meeting.
Can
Let
we
me give
move
you-
on
yeah,
from some of
you
the
gotta do
board
just one more?
stuff?
Right.
Oh, because you talked about your community stuff. At the Detroit meeting, this is the last one, then we can move. When we had a portion of public comment where the public could comment on agenda items, we never responded. Then there was a public comment portion where they could comment on anything that they wanted. And the understanding is that the superintendent responded to those at the next board meeting. So you didn't have to get into a tit for tat. All I had to do was listen. And so I actually sent people written reports to the things that they raised, which also raised that community feeling that because before they
You're
said,
being heard.
some people said, we come and we leave our things, but nobody ever does it. And so, unfortunately, some of the things they raised related to the board. Some of the things they raised related to the superintendent and my staff. I responded to the superintendent's staff issues, and the board secretary was supposed to respond to things that related only to board issues.
We have some discussion about some of these other entities that we're interested in. The union, for one. I mean, I'd be interested in some discussion about how you all saw or see that relationship as it relates to your superintendency.
Well, I have, in the years I've been in Dayton, I have had 5 different union presidents. So they can't go out and say, well, we've been here
You're rough
for
on
years.
people, James.
And 5 different union presidents. And it's very interesting. The first year I was there, we had a union president that was very collaborative, saw the big picture, saw what was coming from a futuristic standpoint down the pike. And
Just a quick clarifying question. Is that a function of elections only?
election, yeah, election.
Nobody died in office or no one
No,
moved away?
it's
Just
election.
elections?
What about the staff? See, one of the questions I was going to raise is your union a elected union representative controlled union versus you have elected presidents, but you have a staff that's been there for
Essentially runs the
years
union.
and
Yeah,
years?
that's the
No,
Milwaukee
no,
structure.
no, they have an elected president, and each time a new president comes, they have an elected governance board.
But what about the
You don't have
staff?
The staff, they don't have a
They got
permanent
a
staff?
couple secretaries.
They don't have.
They
like
don't have an executive director?
No.
No. Couple
You just give them release
secretaries.
time or something?
I give them release time, and they reimburse us,
Oh,
and
that's a Cambridge
Yeah.
model, too.
Yeah,
And-
Rochester. County.
And this president was very collaborative, and we were headed, site-based management, all the popular words in the early '80s, middle '80s, he was in tune with, and could deliver his membership, And he had a belief that in order to get raises for teachers, you have to continue to support the superintendent and move. If the superintendent's salary is not moving, it doesn't make sense for me to try to move yours. So we need to support the superintendent's position. And he left and went to the state level, and then I convinced him to come back and work for me. So now he's working for me on some legislative issues. But then as we noticed different union presidents coming into office, they came in with different agendas. The agenda to take the superintendent on, the agenda to get rid of the superintendent, and all those things, and I'm still there. And the membership will vote them out because of various reasons. I guess the most devastating experience was a 2-year stint when we had a teacher strike. And a 1960 person was elected in the 1990s. 1960 mentality in the 1990s. And we had just completed going to up at Harvard, going through negotiations training. I went up there and took the training to get more into interest-based bargaining, you know, and we were heading that direction. Then this 1960 person was elected on the agenda to get rid of the superintendent. So we came in and started back crashing, and that set our district back, I would say, 4 or 5 years, based on the collaborative model that we had put in place. And he was not reelected his next time around, so we've gone through that cycle. I'm not anti-union. I'm anti those antiquated policies that they have in their contracts. And the most disturbing thing about the unions, plural in Ohio, because you don't have that General Motors mentality in Ohio, is that they are not looking at the big picture based on what is best for children. And the news media came to me one day and said, James, you should stop saying that. You make people think that you're the only person that's for children. I said, I believe that. I believe that. I do not believe that in Ohio, in Dayton, that they're acting in the best interest of children. You cannot name one program in this country that we have not tried in Dayton based on a collaborative model. And every time when you get to the staff development piece to retrain your workforce, that's a roadblock because you can't mandate staff development. When you get to the point of working with the principals and collaborating, and anything outside of the 7 1/4 hours, it's a roadblock. And then when the younger teachers are coming through, that will come through with the idea, what can we do to educate children? And the veteran teachers are saying, get them out of my classroom. They're eating them alive. I mean, they're eating them alive. The last vote we had was 2 weeks ago on charter schools, and I'm being told the young teachers at the meeting tried to get up in support of charter schools, and they booed them down. And now back in the schools, they're not even speaking to the teachers. Those are the disturbing things that I have about the operational procedures of unions, where all of us go down the line in public education if we don't have the political courage to go in and change their procedures. Not get rid of them, because I know why they're there, but change some of the laws that in Ohio, collective bargaining is legal. Strikes are legal in Ohio.
Well,
I think that's terrible.
But in not in defense of unions. But I mean, and I sympathize with the vote in Dayton. But we are able to. I mean, there wouldn't be charter schools in California if teachers weren't voting to convert their schools. The unions are voting in some places, and I don't know what we learned from. How do you get, and why will some unions view this as a way to enhance public education when other unions will not? And it's not an AFT issue, and it's not an NEA issue, because unions on both sides of the fence are being supported in some school communities.
Well, I think the issue there is, as I mentioned, our collective bargaining unit in education is sort of an offspring of the auto industry.
But I'm saying, I'm in Michigan, and I
heavy-
have union agreements in Battle Creek and Pontiac and Flint and Mount Clemens. You don't get any more auto industry union based than Michigan. But yet, the Michigan Education Association and some of their affiliates have said, we can do
But see,
these things.
I think we're in, I was saying this earlier to Cliff, I think we're in a rope-a-dope stage. I think some unions see all of the school reform and vouchers and charters coming down the road and say, we better hitch at least one of our horses to this to get the criticism away from us for being anti-reform. Because I see no connection between the so-called progressive agendas of the national NEA and the AFT and what plays out at the local level. So if you get past a little bit of school-based management and past a little charter schools and look at working conditions for the bulk of the 55 million children in this country, and especially those in the cities, I don't see unions making the kinds of arrangements with school boards that facilitate the education of children. So, I mean, I'm not anti-union either, but the fact of the matter is, when you get all that cleared away and you talk about, well, we really need an extended day, or we need block scheduling, or we need extended year, or we need X, Y, and Z. It's like, wait, no, that's working conditions. Now, this other stuff is school reform. Now, that's working conditions. If that's the case, no, we're not moving off of that dime. And I've, you know, the union president has said that to me in my class. No, we're not. How about changing transfer rights? No. We're not going there. We're gonna let you have an Edison school, and that'll be quite enough for this year, thank you. Or we're gonna start some pilot schools, as Boston does, or we're gonna school-based management, which I'm beginning to see is sort of
Mixed that best.
yeah. I mean, mixed
Yeah.
result that's best around the education of kids.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, in terms of how it affected my superintendency, I think it's clearly why I'm not a superintendent. I mean, because I've concluded that the teacher union contract is the central, most important document in a school district. And that for all of the talk that a lot of us have about what we're going to do and this and that, it gets down to if it says no in here, and we're not prepared for whatever reason to allow you to do it, it cannot be done. I mean, and that lesson was given to me very swiftly when I came in around the two African American immersion schools and trying to put 7 black teachers over in these schools, and the union basically saying, we're going to show you who is in charge and that you can't do this. And I did it in violation of the contract. They took me to court, and of course they won. But to me, it was really a message about power. It was a message about how to exercise power. It was a message about, for example, Milwaukee's union is one of several unions in the country that when Bob Chase got up talking about new unionism.
You walked out.
Well, not only that, but they sent him a letter, man, making very clear that we're not about to give up all of these gains that we have won. It was a strict labor union mentality.
Right.
And we're doing some work now, and a part of this paper that we're putting out that's going to cause a lot of controversy, because what we did, you know, Debbie knows this about, but what we did was to go back. I'm not talking about the study that we did of the union contract, which I really feel very good about, because I don't think it was an anti-union diatribe, but I think it was a very clear case study of what this union contract is really like. But going further than that, we went back, for example, and looked at when did the union start, the union, not necessarily individual teachers, but when did the union start raising issues about class size? And we trace it back to the point in time when this school district started to become more and more non-white. And the real issues about class size were raised, we believe, as an issue of containment, not as an issue of better education. I mean, as one teacher said it, and we quoted her, if you got to teach niggas, it's better to have fewer of them. So, I mean, there's some very clear, when you look at the reasons why people wanted to transfer out of North Division and get to Vincent or whatever, they talked about things like, you know, the culture of these people. You know, we can't teach in places where people don't value education. And what I'm arguing is that, at least in Milwaukee, that union politics over the last 30 to 35 years have been tied directly into issues of race. And that the labor union mentality of wages, hours, working conditions really sort of focused in on what are we going to do about all of these problem kids. They were the ones who started bringing up, we need to have more special education classes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I guess the point I'm trying to raise here is that for me, the union was like a central reason why I don't feel that some of the things that I thought could be done for kids, that we were not able to do it, you know, to be very blunt. I mean, I think at a point the board was ready, the community was ready, you had all kinds of support, but you had the people who really had the power that was given to them by virtue of that document saying, we're not going to do this.
And that holds.
I agree.
No, let me ask it as a question. Did that? We're talking about unions that leadership is white.
Right.
We have cities, Detroit being one of them, Chicago and others, where the leadership of unions is not. It's African American. Right. Did you notice any difference in the issues that Howard just raised with
that's not the question I wanted to raise.
I know, I want you to answer that. I think you got to answer.
I had a question for Cliff. Since
You need to clarify your statements.
No,
that
the
you made,
president of
I
my
think.
union
I think
was
you
an
need to clarify.
African-American male. He was not as anti-reform as the experience in Milwaukee, but John Elliott was clearly a union president. And if John Elliott, and I'll give you an example, in Michigan, the governor gave money for an extended day and extended year programs, and many communities participated in those programs. And it was clear, you couldn't do it unless you could negotiate with your union the pay for the extended day and extended year. And if you couldn't reach an agreement on how much that was going to be, you could not create it. It didn't matter if the teachers in the school said, because people volunteered to become extended year schools. The principal, the teachers, the parents all agreed. But if we don't reach an agreement on pay, it's not going to happen.
So it's,
And I didn't see that race made a difference in Detroit when I was superintendent. Not the race of the superintendent, not the race of the union, nor the fact that most of the kids were African American. It was still an administration, and I don't want to use the word, sometimes with the union, sometimes on opposite sides. It didn't matter that most of the people on the board were African American except 2 or 3. The politics of it was the same politics that I saw. Maybe some of the comments were not racial comments, but the
impact is the same.
problems and the
Right.
conflict
Right.
were still about who was in power and who was going to get and who wasn't going to get, whether it was middle class blacks or low income blacks or teachers or administrators. It's the same conflict. Race did not say, okay, because all African Americans are in charge, we're going to do what's best for the poor black children in Detroit on every issue. You know what I wanted to ask you, since you
Go ahead.
have a union president that at least is perceived in the list of who are the innovative, reform-minded union presidents in the country, your union president is going to generally be in that short list. So what your experience has been...
Rochester started all this stuff. back then.
No, don't say Dade County. We'll say they
this is where the
started.
conversation, we had a
Do
long
not-
conversation.
yeah, it
No,
don't.
I think that's a good
Sure.
analogy,
Yeah.
Bob, that rover boat.
Rochester.
Because I've always talked about the hijacking of stuff.
Right.
I mean, because for example, with all due respect to everything that we try to do on site-based management, to me, site-based management is essentially a hoax.
Yep.
I mean, because in reality, you ain't managing nothing if 85% of the money has already been determined by the time it gets to you. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, but we give you this little piece of thing over here that y'all can meet and argue about.
Or if they compress
You know.
the issues and reduce the issues to the Xerox machine being moved 10 feet away from where
Right.
it was, and not addressing educational issues at all. On the larger question that you raised, Debbie, yes, he is seen in that light and has been president of the union almost 20 years now. The union itself still suffers externally in Rochester from being a convoluted trade union on the one hand, and they'll come out the gate speaking the rhetoric about educational reform. The 87 contract and its unfulfillment of all of those ideas and dreams has,
Except for salary increases.
yes, that was real, all the reforms in there, has served a useful purpose in Rochester now, because the union isn't a free agent any longer. The clergy, the elected officials, and particularly the business community, and I mean not just the big dogs and Xerox and Kodak, but other businesses that do not have unions, actually have begun to monitor the union within the school district, that is the teachers union within the school district. And the notion of taking a vote of no confidence, for example, on a superintendent or on a principal, used to be the ultimate and the expression of dissatisfaction with leadership. We've got members of the community who will take and have taken votes of no confidence on the union. And what it does, it begins to set up this condition that somebody is indeed looking at life bigger than just the working condition issues. Because I do agree with what was said earlier. I believe the unions will desire to accommodate what they see as things that are inevitable, charter schools, and they will look at it from a point of view of accommodation, because they have no real compelling reason to change unless they are disaffected, and they haven't been. I mean, who has really lost a job? And we go through the 30-28 process in New York, costs about $250,000 per case on average. And we use a variety of things to move people out when they're incompetent. But if there's no real compelling reason for them to change, why buy a cow? They can get the milk free. Well, let's do 2% with charter schools, you know.
Right.
And then we're still here. So and I think this is a deliberate way of seeing themselves once again as reformers. But it's for the reason of protecting what you have articulated, Howard, the holy grail issues around working conditions and that which makes up the stuff about unions. This is why I, really stayed on this collective bargaining last year. When we're about a year late coming in with a new agreement. It was no big deal to me. And this is why in that agreement, I stayed the course on the issue of having parents with the opportunity for them to provide input into the overall evaluation of teachers. That's written into the contract now. It's in 3 different areas. It's not to have input into the evaluation of their pedagogy. Did not do that. And I didn't think that would be appropriate as the education leader. But to have then parents fill us out and be able then to send it to the supervisor of that particular teacher suggests a level of at least inspection, if not accountability, that had not been there before. And when we were doing it, we saw not the union ready to implode, but we saw factions within the union that were ready to implode, and they saw their leadership selling out to the district. But it was around an issue of what parents need to know as customers of what's happening with, their other customers, meeting their kids. We got the returns back. We got about 41,000 returns back. And we're going through an analysis right now. I'm going to probably write something on it for publication. But we're going through an analysis right now by grade, by level, by subject, by type of teacher. And we had argued for the same type of opportunity where teachers would have some input into the overall evaluation of principals. Ironically, the Principals Association, the Administrators Association, they have taken us to arbitration on this issue. And I'm not trying to defend them, but one issue has been that they in Rochester have been seen, and they see themselves, unfortunately, to a large extent, as second class to the teachers union. So they
form is so
that's right.
Right.
And they think that if they do this, there'll be some get back on them. But to me, it's acting out a form of helplessness. So I think we're going to be successful in the arbitration on this. But going back to the more fundamental issue, I don't believe there's any genuine interest or capacity for them to change at the root of things, because at the root of things are those.
This raises a question that hopefully we can get to today. When we get to the question really about, how would we really change districts? I mean, if we had our druthers given our experience, how would we change districts? But I want to try to push us to go on and talk about some of these other elements. We talked about community, politicians.
We talk about
the media.
Yeah, that's the one I
Right.
want.
Let's talk about the media a little bit in terms of how that, impacts or is impacted.
Well, I'm not going to get into the fact that the media covers the negative stuff and all of that, but I think Cliff and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. the difference in the coverage of African-American superintendents and white superintendents.
Yes.
I think that there's a palpable difference, and we do nexus searches on superintendents all over this country, and the rides that white superintendents are given for a longer period of time than black superintendents. And a lot of it ties into expectations, community expectations, and the substance of Hugh's book, Messiah or GOAT issues play into it. But the challenge that the media puts in front of black superintendents, I think, is much higher threshold than it is for our white counterparts. And it is such, I think, that really makes it difficult for people to get second and third jobs, and get haunted by some of the perspectives that the media takes. I mean, I've watched the Boston Globe.
Take a walk.
Literally, I mean, what you think of the current superintendent pays on or not is a whole different matter.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, he's had about 2 negative articles in 2.5 years, and one of them was around taking a reasonably positive stand on trying to figure out Latin school, where his predecessor, daily hammering away at much of the same issues that he's trying to get at. Standards issues, just hammered away. Then you can say, well, she wasn't very good with the media. You can say a lot of things, but it started on the first day, and it lasted until the last day. So for 4 years, she got any sort of misunderstanding was a negative issue. Any positive was turned over to see if it was a negative on the other side. And I see that, as I say, we study lots and lots of superintendents, and I see that all too frequently. The issue of interviewing Deborah McGriff, I still have that article, and the reporter telling you that people considered you a bitch. Now, I've never seen that anywhere before. People say you're a bitch. Are you? Where's that all coming from?
But they do that, if you read about women in business and women who are
Let's don't get to the gender issue.
No, that is something they do. I mean, they will describe the same trait in a male using a positive term, and that same quality in a woman is considered negative. I mean, you're not going to get to head an organization trying to be everybody's friend, because it's just not going to happen. But, and so, I mean, if you're a woman and you want to make it to the top of an organization, you accept it, you answer the question, and you keep going.
But those are, and I can strongly concur with what you're saying, because I'm in a state where we only have 5 African-American superintendents out of 611. And I'm in a county where we have 17 school districts, and we have 3 African-Americans out of the 17. And I'm the largest school district in that county structure. And the media will always view me as arrogant. I utilize
Favorite term.
I utilize.
The only other one is
But in your case,
I threaten people, and people are fearful. And the first thing to come out about the Williams and the union must develop a relationship because I've done all these wrong things
It's your
to
burden.
teachers. But how many teachers have I fired since I've been here, folks? Go back and look. 1, and it's still in court. And then I have a very good friend that's a white superintendent, Dr. Stephen Scoville, who's my next door neighbor. And they did a profile of us, and Steve is a whole different, very smart man, will stand on tables and get into meetings and turn them out. But they say he's aggressive and he's bright, he's smart. So they did an article on us, and Steve told him, said, James Williams is way smarter than I am because, number one, look at the challenges he's facing in Dayton, and look how long he stayed there. And you all need to get off this soapbox about how great I am and the things that he's doing. But I think it's done for a reason, because let someone come to Dayton and question about me being a superintendent someplace else, or they wear you out. Next door neighbor, white, you find out they're leaving the day they are leaving. And I'll never forget when Franklin Smith left Dayton, Ohio. And I brought this up at Danforth, and they were talking about this. and how they dogged him on the radio and the newspaper about collecting money to put him on a mule to get him out of town. I mean, they would have never done that
Both had the same writer.
to a white superintendent. Never. Every time the discussion is brought up about my salary or getting a raise, it becomes a media event. They go and post everything. And I'm the lowest paid superintendent in the county based on enrollment.
What do you do about that in terms of the media?
See, my experience, and I have to just be on the record, is my overall media experience in Detroit was extremely positive.
And mine was.
And,
Mine
I
was
mean,
here.
there was a great
Well,
balance.
mine is extremely
in
positive, but
negatives
you
and
find the
positive
incidents.
stuff.
Right. Can we take a break right here, because he's about to run out of tape, but I want to
Okay.
pick back up on this.
Mhm.
And
This
so
is-
we can stop.